Hey guys, tonight we're drawing the velvet curtains, stepping softly across candlelit stone floors, and sinking deep into the silken, scandalous world of royal intimacy. Imagine flickering torches along vast corridors, the distant clink of goblets, echoing down halls heavy with secrets, and behind every thick wooden door, a story of lust power, expectation, and protocol. This isn't your standard history of kings and queens. It's what happened once the crown came off and the bedroom doors closed. But beware, what you're about to discover might change the way you think of castles forever. Between public duties and royal lineage, sex in royal chambers wasn't private, passionate, or personal. It was policy. It was legacy. And sometimes it was punishment. You probably won't survive this night behind the tapestries because comfort, desire, and pleasure weren't guaranteed, not even for the crowned heads. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Also, let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you. I love seeing how far these midnight wanderings reach. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're standing in a chamber so vast, the ceiling disappears into shadows. A fireplace crackles with lazy orange flames, and two servants scurry out the side door, leaving behind a steaming basin and a linen cloth. You're not alone. The queen is seated in a high-backed chair, her corset only half-laced her face, a mask of calm. Across the room, the king adjusts his doublet. This isn't a private moment. There's a chamberlain outside, two ladies in waiting just a curtain away, and somewhere deeper in the shadows, a physician waiting to confirm the act has taken place. Because in many courts, especially in early modern Europe, consummation was a matter of national security. From Tudor England to Bourbon France, marriage wasn't just about companionship. It was a transaction, a treaty, a union of kingdoms. The bedchamber then was a war room of another kind. This was where alliances were sealed, heirs were conceived, and power was physically passed on. But don't imagine dim, candlelit kisses and stolen whispers. Imagine instead an audience, sometimes real, sometimes ceremonial. In France, for example, after a royal wedding, the public bedding ceremony was a thing. The newlyweds were paraded through the court, brought to their bed, and symbolically tucked in while onlookers sang, laughed, and sometimes jostled to catch a glimpse of the sheets. You glanced nervously at the massive bed canopied with damask curtains embroidered in gold. But behind its opulence lies a heavy truth. The expectation was duty first, desire second, or not at all. The queen didn't have to be in the mood. She had to be fertile. The king didn't have to be romantic. He had to be productive. If he failed to consummate the marriage quickly and effectively, rumors could ripple through the court faster than a sword drawn in the throne room. Now imagine being Louis XVI of France. Awkward, shy, possibly suffering from a mild anatomical issue, or simply terrified. For 7 years, he and Marie Antoinette failed to produce an heir. While pastries and powdered wigs distracted the court ambassadors, sent nervous reports back to Vienna, wondering if France would ever see a dauphin. Bedroom politics became state politics. Marie was blamed, mocked, pitied. Louis was ridiculed, dissected, and discussed at court breakfasts. Sex wasn't private for royalty. It was public policy. But let's leave Versailles and cross the English Channel. Step into the icy corridors of the Tower of London. It's 1540, and Henry VIII has just annulled his fourth marriage, Anne of Cleves. Why? The answer lay apparently in her body. Henry famously declared she was nothing so fair as she hath been reported, and after their wedding night he claimed he had been unable to complete his duty. In other words, no sex, no consummation, and thus no marriage. Anne's lucky escape earned her a generous settlement and the nickname the king's beloved sister. But the lesson was clear: a queen's body had to please and produce, or she was replaceable. You feel the weight of expectation in the very air of these royal rooms. The thick tapestries can't muffle the tension. A night in the royal bedchamber was about performance, sometimes literal. In medieval Scandinavia, witnesses were sometimes required to inspect bloody sheets as proof of virginity and consummation. In England, a failure to consummate could be grounds for annulment, a scandalous outcome that often left one party humiliated and the other politically unmoored. Even when the candles were snuffed and the doors closed, the eyes of the court were never far. But what about passion? Was there ever room for it? Yes, but it had to hide in the shadows. Royal lovers often found their freedom not with their spouses, but with mistresses, lovers, or even chambermaids. Courtiers learned quickly that proximity to the royal body was dangerous. One wrong glance, one whispered rumor, one bed too close to the throne, and your head might roll. You walk now through the private apartments of an empress where scents of rose water linger. Here the rules shift. In some cultures, like the Ottoman Empire, the Sultan's harem was a place of both pleasure and politics. The favored concubine might wield immense power. The mother of the Sultan's first son could voue to the rank of Valide Sultan Queen Mother. Seduction was a career path. But even there, sex wasn't just about pleasure, it was about survival. The deeper you go into these palaces, the more you realize every kiss, every caress, every groan behind silk sheets was weighed against political gain, reputation, and dynasty. Royal sex wasn't forbidden, it was demanded. And it was watched, sometimes literally. In 18th century France, courtiers gossiped in Versailles salons about who was seen slipping down which corridor after supper. In the Russian court under Catherine the Great, the empress's lovers were often vetted, trained, and if rumors are true, gifted estates after their service. But service it was. These weren't affairs of the heart. They were duties of the flesh. And so you pull back the curtain of another chamber. The air is warm, scented with musk. A candle sputters. Somewhere outside, a page turns in the book of hours. But in this room, lined with silk and suspicion, history isn't written in ink. It's written in moans, miscarriages, and morning-after declarations of success or failure. Still think being royalty was sexy. Take another step forward. We're just getting started. You keep walking your bare feet now, silent on polished stone, stepping through yet another doorway, veiled in velvet and secrecy. Ahead lies another chamber, this one darker, narrower, more private. The windows are smaller, and the bed less theatrical, but the weight in the air is the same. Here, away from the thrones and grand staircases, sex still didn't belong to the lovers, it belonged to history. It's easy to assume that kings and queens were swathed in indulgence, able to choose their partners at will, unburdened by the rules that bound their subjects. But that fantasy shatters quickly when you realize just how little freedom they had. The king might rule a continent, but his sex life was often dictated by bloodlines, treaties, and generational expectation. The queen, crowned in silks and pearls, might be adored in public, but in private she was a womb on schedule. Ovulation wasn't whispered about, it was charted. Midwives knew before she did. And if she failed to produce an heir, her value could drop overnight. You glance toward the bed again. The linens are fine, yes, but imagine being the queen knowing that every failed night might be recounted at council meetings, whispered through palace halls, or used as leverage by rivals. Think of Mary Queen of Scots. Her marriages weren't romantic endeavors, but carefully chosen strategies. Her first marriage to Francis II of France was a political union. When he died, she returned to Scotland and married Lord Darnley. That union turned toxic fast. Rumors of impotence, violence, and scandal swirled. His eventual murder added another layer to the tragedy, and in every whispered tale between the politics and bloodshed were endless questions about what really happened in their bed. And what about Elizabeth I, the Virgin Queen? Her chastity became propaganda, a political stance, a power move. Whether or not she actually remained celibate, the important thing was that people believed she had. To surrender her body would have been to surrender her authority. Her bedroom wasn't a place of intimacy, it was a fortress of image. Visitors had to be carefully choreographed. Courtiers were vetted. And her closest male companion, Robert Dudley, stirred gossip that danced across Europe. But nothing was confirmed. Because for Elizabeth, sex wasn't private pleasure, it was a weapon. One she wielded by refusing to engage. But let's move away from the queens for a moment and slip into the boots of a courtier. You're a minor noble. Handsome, witty, dressed just well enough to catch the eye, but not well enough to be taken seriously by the king. You live on the fringes of power, desperate for advancement. You know what it takes. You've seen what happens to the men who are granted access to the queen's chamber. Or better yet, to the king's favorite mistress. And so you sharpen your wit. You rehearse your charm. You position yourself near staircases, gardens, corridors, waiting for a glance, a smile, an invitation that could change your future. Because sex at court was currency. Being chosen wasn't just about beauty. It was about timing alliances and the manipulation of desire. And once you were chosen, your world changed. But not always for the better. Consider Diane de Poitiers, mistress to Henry VI of France. She wasn't a young, foolish girl. She was calculated, brilliant, elegant. And she held the king's heart until his death, even though his wife, Catherine de' Medici, bore him all his children. Diane had power, real power, because she understood how to turn intimacy into influence. Yet when Henry died, Catherine exacted her revenge, banishing Diane from court and reclaiming the jewels Diane had once worn with pride. A single death changed everything. Love, or whatever version of it existed, was always on borrowed time. The higher you rise, the harder you fall. You glance out a narrow window and imagine the countless women who were summoned to royal chambers, not out of affection, but out of obligation. Some were wives, others were chosen, and some were barely more than captives. In the Russian court, Peter the Great was known for his intensity in war, in politics, and in the bedroom. His relationships were volatile. His wives and mistresses suffered his violent mood swings, his obsession with control, and his need to assert dominance in every domain. Sex for him wasn't always about pleasure, it was about power. A microcosm of the empire he ruled. And his reign wasn't unique. Kings who couldn't control their appetites were as dangerous as those who couldn't command armies. Henry VIII discarded wives like pawns on a chessboard. Ivan the Terrible. His marriages were more like imprisonments, and some of his wives died under mysterious circumstances, either poisoned or simply disappeared. In these rooms, saying no wasn't an option. Consent didn't exist. Royal blood didn't protect women from the whims of their lords. In fact, it often placed them directly in harm's way. Even in more stable courts, places where laughter echoed through banquet halls and musicians played through twilight, the bed remained a place of tension. For royal women, pleasure was secondary to conception, and the moment of intimacy was often interrupted or observed. In many traditions, midwives were brought in to verify the act. Sheets were inspected, breasts examined. If the queen's belly didn't swell after a few months, speculation grew loud. And what of contraception? Forget it. Most royal courts considered any interference with fertility as sinful or treasonous. But this didn't stop experimentation. In Renaissance Italy, elite women sometimes turned to herbal infusions or primitive barrier methods whispered about in apothecary shops. The results were inconsistent, the risks high. If discovered, the punishment ranged from exile to execution. Still, some women took the gamble. The thought of another pregnancy, another labor, especially without anesthesia, was enough to make them desperate. After all, childbirth was the most dangerous night of a queen's life. Even in the most opulent palaces, death lingered in the birthing chamber. And sometimes, a night of royal duty became a sentence. You pause by a gilded bedpost, running your fingers across the grooves in the wood. How many hopes were pinned on this mattress? How many alliances, how many disappointments? In these royal quarters, love wasn't just rare, it was risky. A king who fell in love with a servant girl risked scandal, rebellion, even war. A queen who turned her eyes toward a court musician could bring down a dynasty. The body was never truly one's own, not in court, not with titles at stake. And so the nights wore on. Some were filled with duty, others desire. A few perhaps with real affection, but they all left traces. Whispers in the hallways, a sigh behind a curtain, a blotch of red on white linen. Evidence. Proof politics. You move to the next door. Another chamber. Another story. The next room feels warmer somehow. Not because of the fire, it's dimmer here, the embers barely glowing, but because of what it holds. It's quieter, softer, less ceremonial. This isn't the king's chamber or the queen's. It belongs to someone caught between ranks. A duchess, perhaps. A count. A courtier with access. Someone with just enough power to have their own space, but not enough to keep it sacred. You step over a fur rug, its edges frayed. The bed is modest, the linen's plain. But the tension in the room is unmistakable. Because in this space, sex wasn't duty, it was strategy. Court life was a game of survival. If you were clever, beautiful, and daring, sex became your tool of ascent. For women who weren't royal, but moved in those elite circles, ladies in waiting, noble daughters, widows, sexual availability could mean everything. One well-timed affair, one shared night behind locked doors, could change the course of a life, or ruin it. You sit for a moment imagining yourself as a young noblewoman. You've been presented at court. You've danced at feasts. You've caught the eye of a duke, or worse, the king. You know what's expected. You've seen what happens to girls who refuse. They're either dismissed quietly or sent to the countryside in shame. But if you say yes, you gain access. Jewelry, favors. Your brother gets a military promotion. Your father's debts are forgiven. But in the morning, you're just another story whispered over breakfast. Take the example of Barbara Palmer, Lady Castlemaine, one of King Charles II's most famous mistresses. She wasn't royal, but she became a fixture of the English court. Her influence was enormous. She bore the king multiple children and was handsomely rewarded. Yet she was also mocked, painted as licentious, manipulative, and power-hungry. Her rivals hated her. The public judged her. But Barbara understood the game. She knew that the bed was a throne of its own, one where you didn't wear a crown, but wielded it nonetheless. Not every mistress fared so well. In the French court, a woman might rise quickly only to fall with equal speed. She might be replaced, ignored, or even imprisoned if her presence stirred too much scandal. Jeanne du Barry, Louis XV's last mistress, was charming and fashionable, but her low birth made her an object of derision. When the king died, she was banished from court. During the Revolution, she was arrested and executed by guillotine. Her body, once bathed in perfume and swathed in silk, ended up in a common grave. You take a breath. The air feels heavier now, because in every royal court, sex had layers. It wasn't just about politics or pleasure, it was about performance, and not just in the bed. Mistresses were expected to play the part dress, while smile strategically, remain silent when needed, and entertain without overstepping. They were trophies and threats. If they became too powerful, they were dangerous. If they disappeared too quietly, it meant they were never truly seen. And yet many played the part brilliantly. Madame de Pompadour, for instance, was more than a lover to Louis XV. She was his advisor, confidant, and cultural ambassador. Even after their physical relationship ended, she remained at court for years, shaping art, architecture, and political decisions. She wasn't merely a bed partner. She was a courtly operator. But not every woman wanted the game. Some were trapped in it. You glance at the door closed, bolted from within. Privacy, finally. But only for a moment. Because servants, chambermaids, guards, and gossips were never far. Even in your own chamber, your body wasn't yours. You might be called upon by the king without warning. Or worse, seduced by a visiting noble who promises marriage only to vanish before sunrise. And if you ended up pregnant, disaster. Unwed mothers in royal courts were shamed, hidden, or quietly exiled. Some were forced into convents. Others died during childbirth, their stories erased from history. Their lovers rarely suffered. A man might lose a bit of reputation, but his status often protected him. For the woman, it was everything. A single mistake could end a dynasty or her life. You run your hand along the carved frame of the bed. It's beautiful, elegant, deceptive. Just like court life itself. Because while kings and queens used sex for legacy, courtiers used it for survival. And everything depended on timing. Take the case of Anne Boleyn. She began as a lady-in-waiting. Her flirtation with Henry VIII ignited one of history's most infamous romances. But Anne didn't give in easily. She refused him for years, demanding marriage. When he finally divorced Catherine of Aragon and made Anne his queen, it seemed like victory. But she couldn't give him a son. And in just a few years, she was accused of adultery, incest, and treason. She was beheaded, her body buried in an unmarked grave. Her rise was meteoric, her fall catastrophic. And for every Anne, there were countless others, less famous, less fortunate. Their names lost, their stories scattered in palace archives. You imagine yourself waking in this room the next morning. No lover beside you. Just silence. A note slipped under the door. A glance from a maid that tells you everything you're no longer wanted. The court has moved on. The next beauty is already being dressed in the room down the hall. You leave the chamber. As you walk down the hall, you realize that these weren't romantic tales. They were cautionary ones. Sex in the royal courts wasn't the stuff of fairy tales. It was a minefield. One misstep, one miscalculation, and you were finished. But some played the long game. Some women and men learned how to use proximity to power as leverage. They cultivated personas. They chose their moments carefully. And sometimes, against all odds, they survived. They became legends, or at least rumors. And in the end, maybe that was enough. You stop before another door, larger than the last, embroidered with a crest you can't quite recognize. This room, this one might belong to someone truly powerful, a monarch with needs, desires, and a dangerous appetite for both. You push the door open. The chamber beyond is vast, opulent, yet intimidating. Walls are hung with embroidered tapestries depicting mythical beasts and half-naked gods. The scent of clove and sandalwood clings to the air, masking something else more primal. This is not a room of retreat. It's a stage. And tonight, you are stepping onto it. This is the private domain of a monarch who ruled not just with ink and decree, but with appetite. Not all kings and queens were passive players in the sexual politics of their courts. Some dominated those spaces with ferocity. Here, the bed wasn't a place of obligation, it was a throne of desire. But even that desire was bound by custom hierarchy and the shifting sands of political power. You find yourself face to face with a portrait, massive looming of the monarch who once occupied this room. His gaze is hungry, his lips curled into a smirk. History remembers him as charming but ruthless, and his bedroom was as much a place of manipulation as his council chamber. He used his body like a weapon, and he expected those around him to do the same. Think of Henry IV of France, le Vert Galant, the Green Gallant, who had so many mistresses they became a second court. His official maîtresse en titre, Gabrielle d'Estrées, held enormous influence. She was given lands, jewelry titles, but she also bore the burden of being loved by a man who belonged to the world. She died under mysterious circumstances, poisoned, some said, while pregnant with his child. No one was ever held accountable. Desire at that level of power was dangerous. And then there was Louis XV. As he aged, his mistresses became younger, more anonymous. He established the Parc aux Cerfs, a house near Versailles, where young girls were brought for his pleasure. The king believed he was above consequence. But each secret rendezvous chipped away at the moral authority of the crown. The people began to murmur, and revolution was already sharpening its blade. You shiver, because as much as royal sex could be about pleasure, it was never free from danger. For the king, indulgence risked scandal. For everyone else, indulgence risked everything. Now consider the opposite. A queen who took lovers. You step softly past a chaise longue and into a curtained alcove where a diary lies open on a table. A faint script trails across the page, and though the ink has faded, the words burn. It's not a confession, it's a strategy. Queens too had desires. But unlike kings, they were rarely permitted to explore them, unless they were very, very careful. One of the most scandalous tales in royal history is that of Queen Caroline Matilda of Denmark. She was married off to King Christian VII, a man known for his erratic behavior and mental instability. The marriage was cold, political, and utterly devoid of connection. So when Caroline Matilda fell in love with the royal physician Johann Struensee, it wasn't just an affair, it was rebellion. Struensee gained incredible influence over the king, issuing laws in his name and reforming the kingdom. But their affair was discovered. Struensee was arrested, tortured, and executed. Caroline was divorced, exiled, and forbidden from seeing her children again. The risk of loving outside the marriage bed was immense, especially for queens. Because while kings might be praised for their virility, queens were judged mercilessly. A pregnant queen who couldn't guarantee the baby was royal blood. That was an existential threat to the monarchy. You take a seat beside the massive bed. You imagine the weight of the crown pressing on your brow even as you disrobe. You imagine the fear not of physical intimacy, but of political fallout. Every moment in this room has a ripple effect far beyond these walls. A single misplaced kiss could end a generation. And yet, some monarchs risked it anyway. Catherine the Great of Russia is perhaps the most famous example. Her list of lovers was long, but what made her unique was her unapologetic embrace of desire. She didn't hide her passions, she institutionalized them. After her husband's assassination, which she may have known about, she ruled alone and ruled well. Her lovers were often elevated to positions of power, but also dismissed as easily. Rumors of her sexual appetite grew wild in Western Europe, some of them grotesque and misogynistic. But they all said the same thing: she was a woman who ruled her court, her country, and her bed. Yet Catherine, too, was careful. Her lovers were vetted, trusted, and always disposable, because trust was fleeting in the royal chambers. Spies were everywhere, rivals, courtiers, even servants. Pillows held secrets. Sheets betrayed stains. Love letters went missing, only to reappear in enemy hands. You stand again, tracing your fingers along the frame of a mirror, so tall and gilded it reaches toward the ceiling. You imagine a queen standing before it, adjusting her bodice, rehearsing her smile. Not for her husband, not for her lover, but for her court, for the portraits being painted, for the histories being written. She doesn't have the luxury of privacy. Even pleasure must be premeditated. And then just beyond the mirror, a hidden door. You didn't see it before. It opens with a faint click, revealing a passage lined with cold stone. This is how lovers slipped in and out, how scandal walked quietly past guards, how secrets tried to stay buried. But nothing stayed hidden forever. Not the affair of Marie Antoinette with Count Axel von Fersen, oh long rumored, never proven. Not the whispered liaisons of James I of England with his male favorites, whose influence stirred political fury. Not the secret child of a Spanish queen. Not the letters burned too late. You descend the passage slowly. This was the anatomy of power, a heartbeat behind every door, a pair of eyes always watching. And in the center of it all, sex sometimes wanted, sometimes not. Sometimes gentle, often cold, but never simple. You reach the end of the passage. Another chamber. Another throne cloaked in bed sheets. The game continues. The new chamber you enter feels different. Not colder, not warmer, just heavier. The ceiling is low, the air still almost stagnant. No fire burns here. Only the smell of beeswax candles and fading perfume lingers in the shadows. This room wasn't designed for display, but discretion. You're in the innermost sanctum now, the royal mistress's quarters. Not a wife, not a queen, but someone whose presence carried just as much influence, sometimes even more. Here, sex wasn't ceremonial. It wasn't reproductive. It was indulgent, orchestrated, and entirely political. And it came with a dangerous kind of power. The royal mistress occupied a strange space in the hierarchy of court. She could command attention, shape foreign policy, and even influence who was granted titles or estates. And yet she had no legitimate status. Her worth existed entirely within the confines of favor. One change in mood, one wrinkle in the royal sheets, and her position vanished. You look around. The room is elegant, yes, but more intimate than the grand royal chambers. A writing desk sits near the window, piled with notes and correspondence. Embroidered pillows are stacked carefully on the bed, not out of comfort, but out of performance. Because everything in this room had to send a message: I please the king. I am indispensable. I am the gatekeeper. You sit on the edge of the bed. You think of Madame de Montespan, perhaps the most powerful of Louis XIV's mistresses. Beautiful, witty, politically savvy, she lived lavishly, bore the king several children, and even influenced royal appointments. But behind the perfumes and pearls was a darker truth. She was constantly competing with other women, fighting for attention, fearing the fall. And it came. After years of dominance, she was implicated in the infamous affair of the poisons, a scandal involving black masses, love potions, and alleged witchcraft. Whether she truly participated or was merely targeted out of jealousy, her influence waned. The Sun King turned his gaze elsewhere. Montespan retreated to a convent. Her story is a perfect example of how quickly the temperature in a royal bed could drop from scorching to freezing in a single season. You imagine being her. One day you're sharing breakfast with the king. The next, your name is whispered with suspicion. You fall asleep in satin. You wake up irrelevant. And it wasn't just France. In England, Nell Gwyn went from orange seller to actress to mistress of Charles II. She wasn't titled nobility, but her charm won her the king's favor. While her rivals plotted and connived, Nell remained witty, approachable, and self-deprecating, qualities that endeared her not only to the king, but to the public. Even today, she's remembered with surprising fondness. But she too was always just a turn of favor away from exile. The line between mistress and pawn was razor thin. And then there were those who wanted to be mistresses, ambitious women whose families pushed them forward like pieces on a chessboard. Fathers and brothers encouraged flirtation. Mothers coached their daughters on posture, tone, fragrance. Entire generations of noblewomen were groomed not for marriage but for seduction. It was quite literally a career path. A way to survive. You walk to the vanity noticing how worn the brushes are, how frequently replaced the pots of rouge. There's a mirror here smaller than the grand one in the Queen's room, but more honest. No gold frame, no pretensions, just the daily reminder that your face is currency and your time is limited. Because what happens to the mistress who ages? In some courts, she is quietly pensioned off, sent to a country estate, gifted a modest title, perhaps even married off to a lower noble. In others, she is simply forgotten, replaced by youth, new skin, new curves, the scent of something unfamiliar to reawaken the king's interest. And what happens if she bears a child? That depends. If the king acknowledges the child, they might be granted a title, educated at court, woven into the dynasty's fabric. If not, the child is hidden, sent to an abbey, or raised quietly in the countryside. The mistress, meanwhile, must walk a delicate line, protecting her child's future while preserving her own relevance. You think of Hortense Mancini, niece of Cardinal Mazarin and lover of Charles II. Brilliant, daring, and far ahead of her time, she fled. An abusive marriage, became a celebrated writer, and engaged with multiple lovers, male and female. She was mistress not just to Charles, but to history itself, a woman who refused to be defined by a single royal affair. But not all stories end in empowerment. You notice now that this chamber, though intimate, has no true lock, no bolt, only a latch. Because even the king's mistress could not keep the world out. Jealous courtiers, suspicious queens, scheming nobles. They all had ways of reaching her. Poisoned cosmetics, accusations of witchcraft, fabricated letters. The court knew how to destroy a woman, especially one who wielded sexual influence. And so the mistress lived in constant contradiction, desirable but dangerous, praised but precarious. She was adorned in jewels that could become shackles, wrapped in silks that could just as easily be nooses. You draw back the curtain and peek out the window. It overlooks the royal garden. From here she could watch the queen promenade with her attendants. She could spot rivals stealing moments with the king. She could track her own decline in real time. What did she think as she looked out? Was it triumph or dread? You close the curtain gently. There's no satisfaction in knowing you're wanted if you're also disposable. And yet, there was agency here too. Some women used their positions to shape culture, to create art, to fund music and literature. Some became patrons, diplomats, even advisors. They found ways to matter even in the margins. They turned intimacy into leverage. You returned to the bed, running your fingers across the embroidery. Each stitch, each thread holds a secret. How many confidences whispered into pillows? How many betrayals born under silk? This room is no less dangerous than a battlefield. You glance back toward the door. The passage calls again. There's more to see. Because beyond mistresses and queens, beyond courtiers and gossip, lies a world even more hidden, where bodies weren't just used for pleasure or politics, but for survival in the grimmest sense. You step into the shadows once more. Your feet echo softly as you descend the stone corridor. The air is colder now, damper. The light fades with every step. You're leaving behind the perfumed luxury of royal beds and stepping into a space rarely spoken of, one that existed outside the court's gilded narrative. Down here, the tapestries are gone. The velvet is gone. The rules remain, but they're more brutal. You've reached the servants' quarters, because for every royal tryst, every affair remembered in paintings and gossip, there was someone else nearby, watching, waiting, obeying. The royal household ran on the backs of invisible bodies, chambermaids, pages, footmen, wet nurses, laundresses. And for many of them, sex wasn't political. It was dangerous. You enter a narrow room barely wider than a closet, where a thin straw mattress lies against the wall. There's no lock on the door, no privacy. Just worn linen-chipped pottery and a single candle melted down to its base. This is where a young maid might sleep if she was lucky. And more often than not, she didn't sleep alone. Not by choice, but by command. Royal courts were hierarchical labyrinths. Servants had no voice, no protection. A passing glance from a duke, a whispered command from a prince. And that was it. She'd be summoned, often under threat, often under the pretense of loyalty or flattery. And when it was over, she was expected to clean up and return to her duties. No one defended her. You sit on the edge of the mattress. It crunches beneath you, stiff and unyielding. Imagine being 16, fresh from the countryside, hired to serve wine or carry towels. Within a week, you're pulled into a room where candles flicker and laughter dies the moment you enter. A nobleman gestures to the bed. No witnesses, no escape, just silence. This was not scandal. This was standard. And sometimes, when the king or his favorites grew bored of courtly rituals, they turned to the staff. There was no danger of political fallout, no threat of gossip if the girl had no family name to tarnish. Her tears wouldn't make it past the chamber walls. You glance at the tiny window, too high to see out of, just enough to let in a sliver of moonlight. If she became pregnant, her life collapsed. No titles, no pensions, no ceremony. She would be dismissed, sent to a convent, or worse. She might be forced to abandon the baby or handed over to the Royal Foundling Hospital's institutions built to erase problems discreetly. If the child resembled its father too much, rumors might swirl. But most of the time, no one cared. And for male servants, the situation wasn't much safer. In royal courts, power flowed downward like wine at a banquet. If a lady-in-waiting grew curious, if a bored duchess took interest in a stable boy, he could not refuse. He couldn't say no to a noblewoman, nor could he tell anyone if he was coerced. If the affair was discovered, he'd be punished. She might be scolded or relocated. He could be whipped, castrated, imprisoned, even killed. Desire didn't need consent. It needed access. And access was everywhere. In some courts, like those of Renaissance Italy or Bourbon France, there were entire systems to handle these interactions. Officials whose quiet job it was to clean up after noblemen, to silence staff, to pay off families. Privacy wasn't necessary. Secrecy was. You pace the room now, tracing your hand along the uneven stone wall. In places you feel names scratched faintly into the mortar. Servants leaving some proof that they existed, that they were here, that they mattered, because history doesn't remember them. You've read the names of kings and queens, lovers and mistresses, but never the name of the chambermaid, who was summoned once, just once, and paid the price for the rest of her life. She may have passed the queen in the hall the next morning holding towels. No one would guess what had happened. Her face would be still, her hands trembling, her life changed. The court may seem dazzling from above, silk gowns, golden crowns, music wafting through ballrooms. But below, in these hidden quarters, survival was a daily performance, and the cost of failure was silence. Still, not all servant sexuality was rooted in violence. Some found love in stolen corners behind linen carts or near the stables, a page and a scullery maid, a cook's apprentice and a chamber pot boy. Their relationships were forbidden but genuine. They weren't aiming to rise. They were simply trying to feel human. But even these romances came with risk. If discovered, they could be separated, fired, or punished. Their belongings rifled through. Their letters burned. A misplaced smile could ruin everything. You sit by the window now. Outside, somewhere far above you, the grand halls stretch and glitter with music and perfume. But down here, it's quiet. Still. You wonder how many eyes were red with tears during those royal weddings, not because of envy, but because they knew what had been lost. How many servants saw a lover taken into the queen's chamber and never saw them again? Sex in the royal court wasn't just about the royals. It was about power, and power always trickled down. And in its shadow, countless bodies were used, forgotten, erased. You blow out the candle. But as you rise, a new door appears in the wall. Hidden, narrow. You open it carefully, step through, and begin to climb. You're returning now not to the court above, but to a room on its edge. A place not royal, not servant, but something in between. A place where desire blurred the lines even more dangerously. Where same-sex attractions stirred beneath powdered wigs. Where longing hid behind glances. Where danger came not from the act, but from who you dared to love. You ascend into a room cloaked in hush. It's not large, but it's elegant in a subdued way, a space curated for discretion rather than display. Here, the candlelight dances more cautiously, casting shadows long and soft across the paneled walls. This isn't the bedchamber of a king or queen, nor the servant's straw-stuffed cot. It belongs to someone of status, yet not quite power. A courtier, a tutor, a companion. Someone who has learned how to live between the lines. And tonight, you feel a tremble in the air. The kind of tremble that comes when desire is both present and forbidden. This was the other side of royal intimacy. The one that never made it into the portraits. The one not recorded in lineage charts or dynastic records. Same-sex relationships in royal courts were not unheard of. They were simply erased, disguised or quietly accepted with a nod and averted gaze. You look toward the bed, small, neatly made, tucked beneath a window overlooking the garden. A single glove lies across the pillow. Next to it, a letter. Folded and refolded so many times, the creases threaten to tear. The writing is delicate, almost reverent. It speaks of longing, of shared glances across the great hall, of hands that brushed too long when exchanging a goblet, of nights spent pacing, imagining what might never be. The language is cautious, carefully genderless, but the meaning is unmistakable. Because to love another man or another woman within these walls wasn't just scandalous, it was treasonous, a risk to status, safety, and sometimes life itself. And yet it happened. It happened when pages lingered too long outside chambers, when handmaidens shared whispered laughter as they dressed the queen, when noble sons were sent away for military training and discovered affection in the tent next door, when artists caught the eye of their patron, not with flattery, but with admiration that cut deeper. One of the most whispered about monarchs in this regard was King James I of England. His affection for his male favorites, particularly Robert Carr and later George Villiers, Duke of Buckingham, was documented in letters still preserved today. They're not subtle. They speak of love, longing, and emotional intimacy. While historians debate the physical nature of these relationships, what matters most is that everyone at court knew and said nothing, at least not openly. But not all courts were so discreet. In 17th century France, under Louis XIV, rumors of male relationships among courtiers swirled like the powdered wigs they wore. The Chevalier de Lorraine, long associated with Philippe III, Duke of Orléans, Louis's brother, was known to wield significant influence. Their relationship, both romantic and political, challenged the boundaries of courtly decorum. It sparked resentment, jealousy, and yet it persisted. But desire wasn't always about politics. Sometimes it was simply desire. You imagine a young nobleman, handsome, thoughtful, talented. He dances well, recites poetry. He attracts attention, but not always from the women. He falls in love not with the king's daughter, but with her tutor. The attraction grows slowly, privately. A glance in the library, a conversation that lingers too long. They meet under the pretense of study, but their fingers brush, their breath quickens, and they know this must stay secret. If discovered, it could mean disgrace, imprisonment, execution. Depending on the time and place, laws against sodomy were brutal and unforgiving. In some courts, even suspicion was enough. A rival might accuse, a servant might talk, and punishment would be swift. And yet, in these tiny spaces behind grand walls, passion refused to vanish. For women, the situation was even more complex. Female same-sex desire was less documented, not because it didn't exist, but because it was often dismissed as harmless or ignored entirely by men who couldn't fathom its depth. Two ladies-in-waiting who shared a bed might be seen as companions, their tenderness unthreatening, until someone noticed the intensity, the exclusivity, the way one flinched when the other was summoned elsewhere. And then came the separation. No confrontation, just reassignment. A new position in a distant household, letters intercepted, gifts returned, silence. Because the court was always watching. You sit in the high-backed chair by the fireplace, its arms worn smooth by anxious hands. You can feel them, those who once waited here unsure if their secret had been discovered, if a servant had overheard, if a glance across the ballroom had lingered too long. Not all stories ended in punishment. Some survived carefully, quietly. A courtier and a composer who exchanged music and glances for decades. A royal cousin and a poet whose letters were kept hidden in hollow books. A seamstress and a lady's maid who vanished together one spring and were never seen again. They are shadows in the margins of history, but they are there. Desire, even when forbidden, leaves fingerprints, and sometimes it found unexpected protection. A monarch who chose to look the other way. A powerful patron who shielded their favorite. A network of trusted allies who whispered warnings in time. But even then, the tension never lifted. You lived always with one eye on the corridor, one ear tuned for your name in hushed tones, one breath away from ruin. You rise and return to the letter on the bed. Its ink is faded, but you read the last line. If I must suffer for this, let it be known I loved honestly. There's no signature, only a pressed sprig of lavender tucked between the folds. You leave the chamber slowly. These were not the scandalous affairs sung in court songs. These were the quiet, aching romances that history tried to forget. But they mattered. Deeply. And just beyond this chamber lies another. One where those aching hearts sometimes collided with the most powerful bodies of all, where royal marriages already cold became even more suffocating. Where queens lay beside kings who loved others, and lovers watched from the shadows, knowing they could never be touched. You move through the passage with quiet steps, your hand brushing the wall for balance. The air shifts again, less musty now, more perfumed. You've come back into the heart of the palace, but this room ahead isn't one of pomp or grandeur. It's muted, almost melancholy. You enter and instantly feel the weight of disappointment in the air. This is the Queen's bedchamber, not during a wedding, not during a celebration, but in the long, silent years afterward, when duty has become routine, when intimacy has turned to ritual, and when both partners lie back to back beneath cold, embroidered sheets. The room is large, yes, but empty. Not of furniture, there's plenty of that. A canopied bed, a gilded writing desk, tapestries showing triumphs long past. But it's emotionally hollow. You feel it. The absence of connection. The loneliness of privilege. Royal marriages weren't chosen for love. They were chosen for power. And often the man and woman in that bed had never even spoken before their wedding. On the wedding night, their clothes would be ceremoniously removed by attendants. They'd be led to the bed under the eyes of the court, the sheets drawn up by nobles and the candles extinguished with prayers for fertility. Then silence. You imagine it. A king barely more than a stranger. A queen expected to offer her body like a treaty. No shared jokes, no warmth. Just obligation. And then the morning after, the questions begin. Was it done? Did he perform? Is there an heir on the way? The queen, still aching, still unsure, must smile through her fatigue. The king, whether satisfied or not, must nod to his advisors and pretend all is well. But what happens when the months stretch on and no pregnancy appears? You walk slowly across the rug, your fingers trailing along the edge of the empty bed. For the queen, infertility, whether hers or the king's, was catastrophic. It meant political instability, whispers in the chapel, plots in the corridors. Her worth diminished by the day. Physicians were summoned. Herbal remedies administered. Prayers said. And still, nothing. And then the blame began. Many queens endured this agony. Catherine of Aragon. Henry VIII's first wife suffered miscarriage after miscarriage. She bore him a daughter, Mary, but failed to deliver a male heir. Her failure, as the court saw it, cost her everything. Henry cast her aside, declared the marriage void, and took Anne Boleyn instead. Catherine lived out her final days in lonely exile, her body broken by childbirth, her spirit crushed by rejection. The bed had become her battlefield, and she had lost. But imagine the other side. A queen who bore children yet received no affection. Her duty complete, but her heart ignored. You think of Maria Theresa of Spain, wife to Louis XIV. While he paraded mistresses through Versailles, she remained in her apartments, pious and quiet. Her pregnancies were endured in silence. Her miscarriages mourned in solitude. Louis visited her bed rarely, and when he did, it was a performance. She died young, worn out by childbirth and neglect. There is no glamour in this room, only duty, only expectation, only pain. You sit at the vanity. Its surface is spotless. The brushes are unused. The perfume bottles untouched. This wasn't a room for seduction. It was a chamber for production. And once that function was fulfilled or failed, the queen became an ornament. Crowned, adored, but unloved. And yet queens were expected to endure it with grace, to never show jealousy, never protest. While the king took lovers and fathered bastards, the queen was bound by chastity. If she looked elsewhere, if she dared to desire, she risked everything. Treason, adultery, death. But some did. Marguerite of Valois, wife of Henry IV, was said to have taken lovers. Beautiful, intelligent, and strong-willed, she resented being used as a pawn in royal politics. Her marriage was loveless, and her body was no longer hers, so she sought comfort where she could. Eventually, she was imprisoned, banished, written out of the narrative. Because the queen may have had power in name, but in the bed she was still expected to submit. And then, there were those nights when submission wasn't asked, but taken. You hesitate at the edge of the bed. You think about the queens who cried into pillows, who lay still beneath men they didn't choose, who endured for the sake of appearances. Royal rape was never spoken of in those terms. It was called marital right. But for many women it was exactly that. A violation, a desecration hidden behind brocade curtains, and no one came to their defense. Because to accuse a king was to topple the world, and so the queen endured, again and again. The pregnancy came. The child was born, the lineage secured, and still the bed remained cold. But not all queens were passive. You glance toward the fireplace where a portrait hangs above the mantel. It shows a queen with eyes like polished steel. She knew the rules, but she broke them. Some queens found ways to assert their agency, to claim their desires even within the cage of courtly expectations. Christina of Sweden defied gender roles entirely. She dressed in men's clothing, refused marriage, and abdicated her throne. She fled her court rather than submit to the idea that her body existed for heirs. Her sexuality remains a subject of debate, but her rebellion is undeniable. She refused to play the part. Others were more subtle. They took lovers in secret, used their chambermaids as messengers, hid their feelings in poems and letters. Some succeeded. Others were exposed and destroyed. But all of them had one thing in common: their sex lives were not their own. They belonged to the crown, to the court. to history. You stand again, your hand brushing the carved footboard. How many tears were shed in this bed? How many hopes raised, then shattered? How many queens stared at the ceiling, begging for sleep to steal them away? You walk toward the door. There's more beyond this room, beyond this ache, beyond this chill of duty, because not all intimacy in royal chambers was so restrained. Some of it, though rare, was real, and sometimes, just sometimes, love bloomed where no one expected it, not out of strategy, not out of obligation, but out of shared laughter, trust, and tenderness. You step into the next chamber, unsure but curious. What if amidst all this performance there was a moment of something genuine? The door closes gently behind you, and for the first time tonight, you feel something unexpected in the air, warmth. Not from the fire which burns low and quietly in the hearth, and not from the tapestries or carpets, though they're soft and finely made. No, this warmth is something else. It's the soft glow of peace, of familiarity, of bodies that knew one another not through duty or desperation, but through something older, something deeper. This room belonged to a royal couple who, against all odds, fell in love. You're hesitant to believe it. After all, you've seen the beds of ceremony, the perfumed traps of mistresses' quarters, the narrow straw mattresses of servants, the silent ache of queens. You've stopped expecting affection in these rooms. But here in this space, it lingers like scent in the air. Not overwhelming, just enough to notice. The sheets are wrinkled, the pillows uneven, as if someone had just risen from sleep. A half-empty cup sits near the bedside, forgotten. There's a robe draped casually across the foot of the bed, not laid out by servants, just left, like someone comfortable enough to forget formality. It feels lived in, and that's rare. Because in royal households, love, true love, was an accident, a miracle, a rebellion. And when it happened, it was quietly protected, fiercely guarded, and sometimes beautifully tragic. You think of Queen Victoria and Prince Albert. Their marriage, though arranged in the fashion of their time, blossomed into a partnership marked by devotion and mutual admiration. Victoria adored him. She wrote about him constantly. After his death, she wore mourning black for the rest of her life. She refused to sleep in another bed, refused to move on. Every room she entered afterward carried the weight of his absence. Their physical relationship wasn't just political, it was passionate. Letters between them reveal flirtation, desire, and genuine emotional intimacy. They wrote about touching hands, exchanging glances, longing for each other's presence. Their bedchamber wasn't just for heirs, it was for comfort. But theirs was a rare case. Another example, perhaps less conventional, was King George III and Queen Charlotte. Despite his later mental illness, they were affectionate, playful even. They wrote each other poems. They played music together. They shared a bed, not just out of obligation, but choice. They had 15 children, not all of them planned, certainly, but the product of a relationship that sustained them through unimaginable pressures. And not all such couples were kings and queens. Sometimes love bloomed lower on the courtly ladder between a prince and a noblewoman he wasn't supposed to notice, or a widowed duchess and the artist painting her portrait. In those rare and quiet moments, desire wasn't orchestrated, it was discovered. You approach the bedside and gently touch the edge of a letter sitting atop a folded blanket. Its handwriting is rushed, uneven. Not the script of a secretary. It's personal. Scrawled by someone in a hurry, someone who couldn't wait to say what needed saying. Come to me after the music fades. It begins. We'll leave the fire burning. I don't want ceremony. I want your hand in mine. Just that. Just for tonight. It's unsigned, but it doesn't need to be. You can feel the intimacy in every word. There's no plan in these lines. No strategy. Just longing. The kind that bubbles up between two people forced into 1,000 roles, 1,000 expectations, and then in secret find a way to be human again. Even kings and queens were allowed to want something real. But such love was never safe. To love truly in a royal court was to carry a risk as sharp as any dagger. Rivals could twist affection into weakness. Enemies could use a lover's letters as leverage. Even the hint of favoritism caused political unrest. If a king loved too openly, he was mocked. If a queen loved too tenderly, she was targeted. A ruler's heart could never be too obvious. And yet, you kneel by the fireplace and find a small wooden box beneath a loose floor tile. It's filled with tokens, nothing valuable. A pressed flower, a faded ribbon, a pebble smooth from years of being carried in a pocket. These were not gifts from ambassadors. These were the things that only lovers understand. Useless to the world, priceless to the heart. Perhaps this is why such love mattered so deeply. Because it existed despite the system. It bloomed in the cracks of protocol. It whispered against the roar of politics. But even the happiest royal couples were not free. Their love, however genuine, was still watched, still documented, still criticized. In public, they held hands a little too rarely. In private, they embraced in the glow of candlelight, hoping no one was listening at the door. You think now of the quiet grief of a royal widow, someone whose lover was lost not in battle but to fever, or childbirth, or betrayal. The bed suddenly too wide, the sheets too cold, and yet the court expected smiles, appearances, strength. There was no space to mourn privately when you wore a crown, and so some clung to the past, kept portraits beside the bed, wrote poems that were never published, had garments stitched from their lovers' old clothes. They made grief into ritual, love into legend, and here in this room you can still feel it. The tenderness that lingered, the warmth that refused to leave, the echo of laughter once shared beneath these very sheets. Not all love stories at court were tragic, but even the best ones were brief. Because power does not allow permanence. You stand now sensing your time here is done. There's one more door ahead. Narrow, a servant's stair. It leads not back into the palace, but outward toward the places where history recorded its dirtiest secrets. You've seen sex as power, as politics, as punishment. But what happens when it becomes spectacle, not private, not even whispered, but orchestrated, exposed, and consumed? The next room waits, and with it a truth even more uncomfortable. The stair creaks beneath your feet as you descend once more. But this time it doesn't feel like a retreat. It feels like a plunge. You've left behind royal affection, rare as it was, and now you step into a room where sex had no intimacy left, no pretense of tenderness, no shimmer of love, only performance. You're in a chamber not of power or pleasure, but of theater. The room is wide, its floor polished like a stage. Along one wall is a tall mirror, cracked but still reflective. Beside it stands a dressing screen, a mannequin torso draped in lace, and an array of garments, some silken, some sheer, some oddly theatrical. This wasn't the queen's wardrobe. It was a costume chest. For display, for role play. for appetite. This is where sex became spectacle. Because for kings and some queens, the bedchamber was not merely a private space. It was a court within a court, and sometimes it became an audience hall of its own. Some monarchs grew bored of ceremonial couplings, tired of the expectations of fertility and legacy. They craved novelty, creativity, and sometimes cruelty. And so they turned their bedrooms into stages populated by actors willing or forced to play parts. You think of Louis XV, especially in his later years. While France teetered toward revolution, he withdrew from the public eye and lost himself in elaborate sexual dramas. His mistresses weren't just companions, they were performers. Some were dressed as shepherdesses, others as nuns. One room at Versailles was rumored to be designed to resemble a rustic village house where the king could act out pastoral fantasies with his courtesans. Whether the women were willing or whether they performed to survive was secondary. Desire, once repressed by royal decorum, erupted into fetish and indulgence. And it wasn't just France. In imperial China, emperors maintained detailed sexual calendars, assigning concubines to specific nights based on astrology, fertility, and political favor. The emperor's bedroom was more bureaucratic than romantic. A woman might be summoned, stripped, inspected, bathed, perfumed, and rolled into the bed in a silk sheet, her name recorded in a log by eunuchs. The act itself observed in silence or behind screens, not for pleasure, for order. You examine the mannequin more closely. Its corset is too small, its lace frayed. It's been used, often, and you wonder how many girls brought from countryside estates, orphanages, or lower noble households were dressed up in this room, turned into visions, told to pretend, to moan, to smile, and then dismissed like stagehands at the end of a play. Sometimes the roles were darker. You think of King Rudolph II of Bohemia, eccentric, paranoid, and deeply withdrawn. His obsessions led him to collect not only art and scientific instruments, but also people. Women and men alike dressed as mythical figures, instructed to recreate ancient rituals for his amusement. His court blurred the lines between art madness and exploitation. In some palaces, masks and orgies were hosted under the guise of celebration. Attendees wore masks, drank heavily, and disappeared behind drapes. But the masks didn't hide class. Servants knew their place. Nobles knew the stakes, and everyone knew who was watching. Because sex, when performed at court, was rarely anonymous. It was often orchestrated for an audience, sometimes literal, sometimes metaphorical. A noble might show off a lover to incite jealousy. A mistress might perform subservience to win back favor. A queen might feign disinterest to reassert power. Every glance, every sigh, every touch, scripted. You run your fingers across the dressing screen. Someone once hid behind it, adjusted her stockings, bit her lip in the mirror, maybe whispered a prayer, and then stepped out not as herself, but as the fantasy. Some performers rose high. Madame du Barry was chosen not for her nobility, but for her beauty. She knew how to play the role. She smiled, laughed, flirted, but she never forgot the truth that she was here only until she was no longer entertaining. Some performers were not so lucky. In Russia, under the rule of certain czars, noble families were required to offer their daughters for inspection at court. Some became brides, others concubines, a few mere playthings. The girls were displayed like livestock, judged not just on beauty, but on obedience. Their future depended on the flick of a monarch's hand. And then there were the private performances. You imagine a narrow corridor leading from this room to a hidden alcove, a space where a small group of nobles gathered in secrecy, curtains drawn, lights dimmed, music playing softly. And in the center, two people told to perform intimacy, sometimes clothed, sometimes not, sometimes strangers, sometimes lovers, but never entirely free. Because in this world, even sex wasn't yours. It belonged to the viewers, to the patrons, to the ones who held titles and gold and fates in their fists. You notice a small table in the corner. Upon it, a velvet pouch, inside a collection of masks, delicate, animal-like, carved with strange grins. They weren't for carnivals, they were for games. Games of anonymity, games of humiliation, games where the rules shifted mid-play and the loser often left in disgrace or worse. Some monarchs dabbled in sadism, others in voyeurism. Some watched hands folded, others joined. All of them demanded control, and yet performers came, some willingly hoping to rise, others reluctantly with no choice. A few learned to navigate this world to manipulate it. They became legends whispered about in side halls and garden alcoves. Lovers who held sway not because they were royal, but because they knew how to read the room, how to use their bodies not just for pleasure, but for power. You stand now uneasy. The mirror still reflects you, but it feels different, as if the room is watching back. Because here, sex wasn't connection. It was currency. It was theater. And every player was replaceable. You step toward the door. There's one last place to visit tonight. A space not quite bedchamber, not quite prison, but where all of these threads, love, violence, performance, desire, collided in their most brutal form. The place where bodies broke and names were erased. You leave behind the glitter of false intimacy and descend into silence. The air cools with each step thickening around you like a wool cloak soaked in fear. No candlelight here, no perfumes, just damp stone iron hinges and shadows that stretch long across the floor. You know before you see it, this chamber isn't about seduction or longing, or even power as you've come to understand it. This is the chamber of consequence. You step through an arched doorway into a room that feels neither wholly private nor wholly public. It's somewhere in between, a space used only when secrecy and shame needed to coexist. It's not a prison exactly, but it has bars, not punishment exactly, but it has rules. This is where scandals were managed, where desire crossed the line into threat, where royal sex stopped being whispered rumor and became political crisis. This is the chamber where bodies were silenced. You walk past an iron-ringed bed with a plain woolen blanket, nothing like the feather-stuffed mattresses of queens or mistresses. There's a stool in the corner, a pitcher of water. No mirror, no fire. The door is heavy, thick. Sound doesn't pass through it. This is where you sent the problem girls, the ones who got pregnant, the ones who said no, the ones who knew too much. In royal courts, sex was tolerated so long as it was controlled, so long as it produced heirs or entertained power. But once it slipped into danger, once a lover demanded too much, or a servant girl spoke too loudly, or a noblewoman's jealousy turned into blackmail, it had to be contained. You think of Anne Vavasour, a maid of honor to Queen Elizabeth I. She became pregnant by Edward de Vere, the Earl of Oxford, a favorite at court. When her pregnancy could no longer be hidden, she was sent to the Tower of London. So was he. Because their affair, though mutual, embarrassed the Queen. It wasn't the sex, it was the scandal. Shame wasn't reserved for commoners. Even royals themselves could be imprisoned when sex threatened the line of succession. George Plantagenet, Duke of Clarence, brother to King Edward IV, was executed in the Tower, allegedly drowned in a barrel of wine after conspiring against the crown. Part of the motivation, his wife Isabella Neville had been accused of using potions to secure her husband's affection. Sex magic, treason by intimacy. You stand at the far wall now where a narrow slot lets in a sliver of dawn. It paints the stone floor like a scar. How many people lay here staring at that same sliver of light, wondering how their desire, once sweet, once thrilling, led them here? It wasn't always violence or betrayal. Sometimes it was just love. Wrong love. Forbidden love. You remember the story of Princess Sophia Dorothea of Celle, wife of future King George III of Great Britain. Trapped in a loveless marriage, she found comfort in the arms of Count Philipp Christoph von Königsmarck. Their affair was passionate, clandestine, and ultimately doomed. When their plan to escape was uncovered, Königsmarck was murdered, his body never found, and Sophia was imprisoned in a remote castle for the remaining 30 years of her life. She was 28. She died alone, because love, when it interfered with power, was criminal. And what of those who were simply inconvenient bastards, for instance? Royal courts were littered with the children of unofficial couplings. Some were acknowledged like Charles II's many offspring. Others were hidden, raised by wet nurses, buried in convents, forgotten. But for the mothers, if they spoke, if they threatened to reveal names or demand status, they were dealt with quietly, efficiently. A sudden illness, a carriage accident, a letter claiming they'd returned to the countryside. The euphemisms piled up like bodies. And not all punishments were physical. Some were reputational. A lady accused of being too forward. A nobleman shamed in pamphlets for ungentlemanly behavior. Court gossip could destroy more thoroughly than execution. You didn't have to die. You just had to be erased. You run your hand along the stone wall. In some places, initials are scratched. Messages, dates. You pause at 1 a.m. 1637. I did not lie. You'll never know who E.M. was. A maid, a mistress, a nobleman, a bastard child. The court forgot them. That's what royal sex did. It erased those it couldn't control. And still the cycle continued. Because the court needed bodies. It needed lovers. It needed desire to power its engines, but only within limits. Step beyond them and you were replaced, or punished, or buried. You walk now to a wooden chest in the corner. Inside are remnants of lives that never made it into the history books, a child's shoe, a necklace with a broken clasp, a handkerchief embroidered with a crest no longer recognized. These were not gifts. These were evidence, collected, hidden, never returned. Because even scandal had to be archived. You close the chest gently. There's a hallway beyond this room, and you follow it now, slowly, silently. You pass a torch sconce with no torch, a broken chair, a locked door, and then a staircase rising again. This one is narrow, winding upward toward the parts of the palace that only a few ever reached. Not the ballrooms, not the feast halls, but the rooms where kings unburdened their guilt, where queens wept into open windows, where secrets finally were buried in prayer. You've seen the seduction, the ceremony, the violence, the loneliness. Now you climb toward what remained when the passion was gone. The stairwell winds tighter now, as if the stone itself is reluctant to let you pass. Your hand slides along the cool wall, fingertips brushing dust that hasn't moved in centuries. This is no servant's staircase. It's narrower, hidden. A passage used only by those seeking quiet, and perhaps penance. When you emerge, the light has changed. No chandeliers here, just the pale gray of early morning filtering through a high-arched window. You're in a chamber that feels almost sacred. Not a chapel, but close. The tapestries are gone. No perfume lingers. Only the faint scent of old parchment and pressed flowers. There's a writing desk, a prayer book, a bed so modest it seems out of place in a palace. This was the room where guilt lived, where former mistresses were tucked away after falling out of favor, where queens retired in shame, where bastards were raised quietly until they were useful or forgotten. This is where desire came to die. You sit on the edge of the bed. It creaks beneath your weight. You imagine a woman here once radiant, once sought after, replaying her rise and fall like a broken ballad. She'd been summoned once with a wink, dressed in silk, bathed in honey. She danced, she laughed, she pleased. And then one day, she was no longer summoned. Her rooms were reassigned, her jewels reclaimed, her name struck gently from the court diary. Now she listens to the bells from the chapel. Now she waits for news that will never come. You glance at the desk. Letters lie there, written in careful script, unsigned, unsent. One speaks of longing, another of repentance, one simply of silence. They aren't love letters. They're something more fragile, attempts to preserve dignity, to create meaning in the wake of dismissal. Because after the royal bed, there was rarely a soft landing. Some were given small estates, country houses, pensions. Others were married off to aging widowers or distant cousins. A few were sent to convents, not as punishment, but as containment. There in cold stone cells, they were expected to forget, to pray their passions away. But memory doesn't obey. You walk to the window. Below, the garden stretches out, neatly trimmed, arranged with unnatural precision. A place for royal strolls, ceremonial air. How many times had she walked there, hoping for a glance from a window above? Hoping the king still remembered her. Hoping her name still tasted sweet on someone's tongue. And what of the men, the courtly lovers who dared too much, who got too close? Their fates were rarely kinder. A mistress might be banished. A male lover might be destroyed. In 18th century Russia, one of Catherine the Great's lovers, Prince Stanisław Poniatowski, was elevated to the throne of Poland, only to become a pawn in her larger political game. Their intimacy made him useful. Once it didn't, he was discarded, left to be humiliated by history. And in England, men like George Villiers, Duke of Buckingham, might rise through royal affection only to fall into violent political rivalry. His assassination was met with mixed mourning. Some wept, others sighed with relief. Affection had a cost. And when it ran out, what remained? You open a drawer in the desk. Inside, rosary beads, a worn lock of hair, a candle burned to the wick. These weren't souvenirs. They were anchors. Ways to hold on to something that had been real, if only briefly. Because even in the court, even with all its machinery and politics and performance, people were still people. They still felt. And when the desire faded, the feelings didn't vanish. They calcified, became grief, resentment, loneliness, especially for those whose whole identity had been wrapped in being desired. What is a mistress without a king? What is a queen without a crown? What is a lover without someone to love? The room around you feels less like a prison now, and more like a tomb, a mausoleum to lost intimacy. There's no scandal left here, only shadows, echoes. But some found power even in their exile. Anne of Austria, queen consort of France and mother to Louis XIV, was sidelined during her husband's reign, ignored in favor of his favorites. But after his death, she became regent, ruling in her son's name with strength and intelligence. The same court that had dismissed her now bowed at her feet. She learned how to turn grief into governance. Others didn't. You sit quietly listening to the wind at the window. It carries with it the breath of those who once loved, once touched, once hoped to be remembered for more than their skin. Not every affair led to disaster. Not every romance ended in exile. But even the happiest royal entanglements had to be survived. Because love at court was never just love. It was a game. And once you stopped playing, the court stopped watching. And so this room becomes your mirror. What do you do when you are no longer wanted? You collect the letters. You light the candle again. You walk the gardens at dawn and practice forgetting. But forgetting never truly comes. You rise now, leaving behind the rosary, the parchment, the memories folded into the mattress seams. One more door remains, and it doesn't lead downward. It leads upward, to the rooms where age lives, where monarchs once golden and beloved sleep beside no one, where lust has long since burned out, where the body sags and regrets bloom. You climb slowly toward the final stages of royal desire. The staircase this time is smooth beneath your fingers, worn by the passage of years, quiet years, forgotten years. At the top, the air is warmer, drier. A stillness sits heavy here, not with menace or shame, but with waiting. This is the final ascent. Not into splendor, but into solitude. You step into the last royal bedchamber, not one of youth or scandal or forbidden touch, but of age. The room is beautiful in a subdued way. It's filled with soft fabrics and heavy furniture. Tapestries line the walls, but they've faded. The embroidery once gleamed with gold thread, now dulled by decades. The fire in the hearth is slow and steady. The bed is massive, but only one side is turned down. The other remains untouched, a tidy reminder of absence. This is the bed of a monarch who has outlived lovers, outlived their youth, outlived their desire. Here, intimacy has been replaced by memory. You move slowly, drawn to the desk, where an old velvet-bound book lies open. It isn't a ledger or a diary. It's a collection of names, some underlined, others simply scrawled and forgotten. Names of those who once occupied space in this bed, this heart, this history. A mistress from decades ago, a spouse long buried, a child born of affection or accident or ambition. The king or queen who lived here no longer holds audiences, no longer hosts masquerades. The whispers of court no longer circle this room. It has become a sanctuary, a museum of self. You sit in the armchair near the fire. Its cushion molds easily beneath you, worn soft by years of weight. Perhaps they sat here too, night after night, watching flames dance, hearing voices from long ago echo in the creaks of the floorboards. You think of Queen Elizabeth I in her final years, the Virgin Queen. Once dazzling, once courted by kings and poets alike, now fading. In the twilight of her life, she sat in chambers filled with portraits of younger days, refusing to see anyone without her makeup. She stood for hours, unwilling to lie in bed, knowing she was nearing death. She who had once weaponized her body now feared its decay. Or Louis XIV, once the glittering Sun King, who in his final years was riddled with illness. He no longer danced at balls, no longer chose mistresses. His body betrayed him. His courtiers whispered about his odors, his infections, the indignity of rot. The bedchamber where he once seduced and ruled became his sickbed. His throne turned to a cradle of slow decline. The royal body had always been an object of fascination. But in the end, it was just flesh. And flesh always gives way. You cross the room to a mirror. Not grand, not golden, just wide enough to reflect what remains. You look, and you see that not yourself, but the one who once lay here long after the applause had faded. They weren't kings or queens anymore. They were people, wrinkled, heavy with memory, dreading the next night. The last one. Because sex at court was never just about pleasure. It was about relevance. And in old age, relevance disappears. You spot a drawer tucked into the base of the bed frame. You open it gently. Inside is a collection of tokens far older than those you saw before. A fan yellowed and cracked. A lock of silver hair tied with a red ribbon. A handwritten recipe for a love potion, its ink long smudged. A dried flower pressed between pages of a forgotten book. These were not for display. These were private relics. Someone held on. To faces. To nights. To touches. Maybe they no longer remembered every name. Maybe the faces blurred in sleep. But the feelings, the heat, the ache, the terror of being left behind, those lasted. Not all monarchs died alone. Some were cared for by loyal servants. Others were surrounded by grandchildren. But even in those moments, there was a singular loneliness, the realization that the body once worshipped, once used for conquest or comfort, was now only a vessel in decline. And if your power had been rooted in seduction, what were you now? A name, a shadow, a burden. You imagine them lying in this bed, hearing servants fuss quietly nearby, feeling the fabric of their nightclothes cling to paper-thin skin, and remembering the first kiss behind a curtain, the secret caress of a forbidden lover, the betrayal of someone once trusted, the scandal they never lived down, the child they never held, and perhaps, just perhaps, the one moment of real love so small and soft, it barely survives in memory, but enough to warm the cold. You move to the writing desk once more. A sheet of parchment bears the final scribbles of a shaking hand. You read them carefully. No one remembered how I loved, only whom I lay beside. But love was there. I swear it. And that's it. There's nothing else here. No heirloom crown, no decree, no last confession. Just the truth left behind by someone who had spent a life in sheets that never truly belonged to them. You rise slowly. There's one more place to go. One more step to take in this long journey through velvet and iron, through roses and ash. The place where the royal body finally finds rest. Where the whispers fall silent. Where there is no longer performance or duty or pleasure. Only peace. The final hallway is silent, muffled by time itself. You leave behind the high windows and upholstered chairs, the perfumes and parchments, the beds that held 1,000 names. There's no more pageantry here, just polished stone, echoless and eternal. You're no longer inside the royal palace. You're beneath it. This is the crypt, not just of bodies, but of desire. You descend slowly into a vault lined with marble tombs, each bearing a name carved in Latin, each flanked by weathered statues who seem to turn their eyes away in shame or reverence. The air is cold, dry, and deeply still. Here the monarchs lie beside spouses they may never have loved, beneath plaques that mention their triumphs in war, but say nothing of who they longed for in the dark. This is where the story of royal sex ends. Not in climax, not in scandal, in stillness. You stop before one tomb in particular, its lid cracked slightly with age, its inscription faded. You can barely make out the name. A queen. Her life defined by 22 years of marriage, 13 pregnancies, 4 surviving children, and 2 known affairs. Her entire legacy reduced to dates and titles. But beneath this slab lie all the unspoken things. The first time she was touched awkwardly formally, in front of whispered witnesses. The second time when she wept after. The night she snuck out of her chamber to meet a poet in the rose garden. The lover who held her and promised to never tell. The morning she watched him ride away and the decade of silence that followed. All of it is here. No one will ever write it in the history books. But the stone remembers. A few tombs down lies a king. His effigy shows him an armor sword in hand, chest puffed in pride. But you know better. You know his bed held courtiers' mistresses, even boys dressed as girls. You know he demanded silence and gave nothing back. That he died believing his secrets died with him. But they didn't. The walls of these chambers remember every moan, every plea, every lie. And as you walk among the tombs, you begin to understand something that changes everything. Sex in royal chambers wasn't about lust. It wasn't even about love. It was about legacy. Desire was a currency, but also a sentence. It lifted some, destroyed others. It built dynasties and shattered minds. It was never truly private, even when whispered in the dark. The royal body was always the property of history, and yet, amidst all the control, all the surveillance and scripting, there were still sparks, brief flickering lights that defied the roles. A brush of fingers beneath a banquet table. A shared glance across a throne room. A stolen night with no witnesses and no regrets. Those moments weren't recorded, but they mattered more than the ceremonies. You stop at one final tomb. It bears no name, only a carving of a hand holding a flower. The stone is smoother visited often. Perhaps it holds a bastard child, a royal lover buried quietly, or a queen exiled and forgotten. You kneel beside it, and for the first time in this journey, you feel no shame, no scandal, only a deep, aching grief for all the love that had no place to live, for all the desire that had no safe bed, for every moan twisted into policy, every kiss sold for influence. You close your eyes. Upstairs, the palace still shines. But down here, the truth rests. Sex for kings, queens, and courtiers was never simple. It was power and punishment, theater and survival. It was obsession. It was sacrifice. And now, it is over. But your journey isn't. Because in the final chamber through one last door, there is a small room waiting. It holds no bed, no throne, no letters. Just the echo of breath, the moment before sleep, and the truth that even in castles with all their gold and glory, people simply wanted to be loved. You step through the final door into a room unlike any other. It's small, quiet, almost empty. No portraits, no heraldry, no crests of dynasties long dead. Just a single window open to the night, where moonlight spills across the floor like melted silver. The silence here is thick, not heavy, not mournful, just complete. You've left behind the noise, the performance, the staged gasps and ceremonial sheets. What remains now is the essence of it all, the longing. Not for titles, not for heirs, for touch, for meaning. The royal bedchambers you've walked through tonight were never really about sex, not in the way you imagined. Not candlelit seduction, not passion wrapped in luxury. They were stories, negotiations, silent wars. Every glance had consequence. Every moan could move borders. Every birth meant the rise or fall of an empire. And yet beneath it all, the same need pulsed through every monarch, every mistress, every maid. The need to be close to someone who sees you not your crown, your gown, your lineage, but your loneliness. You lie down in the corner of the room on a small divan, too modest for a monarch, too elegant for a servant. A room no one claimed. A place between ranks. And in that space you remember them all. The queen who clutched her sheets and prayed not to conceive. The king who surrounded himself with lovers because he feared dying alone. The mistress who mastered her role but never found rest. The servant girl who whispered no into the dark and was never heard again. The young page who caught another boy's eye and spent the rest of his life pretending it hadn't happened. The empress who took a lover to feel something, anything, before she vanished into her titles again. They all passed through royal doors, their bodies used like ink to sign unspoken treaties, their desire hidden beneath powder and silk, their truth erased by heralds and historians. But tonight you've walked among them. You've sat where they sat. You've listened even when they didn't speak. And now here you are, tired, full of shadows, full of stories. The room is still. The wind brushes the window pane gently. Somewhere above, the halls echo again with the sound of music. But you're not drawn to it anymore. You've seen what lies behind the doors. You've felt the silk and the steel. Now your eyes begin to close. Because even the kings grew weary. Even the queens longed for sleep. Even the courtiers dreamed of nights untouched by performance. And in this small room between memory and oblivion, you too can let go. So just rest now. You don't have to remember every name or every story. They're still here, stitched into the walls of forgotten chambers and carried on the quiet breath of stone. The palace can keep its gold. Let it shine for the tourists. You've wandered further. You've pressed your ear to the hidden door, crept past. The silken lies stepped quietly where so many lost their voices. You've seen the desire that ruled empires and ruined hearts. But here in this space, without crowns or candles, you are free. No one is watching you. No one expects you to perform. You can exhale fully. You can sink into the soft edges of nothing. Let your mind quiet. Let your breath slow. Let the moonlight smooth over your skin like calm water. The kings have stopped calling. The queens have stopped weeping. The dancers have removed their masks. It's just you now. And silence. And stillness. You don't have to carry their secrets. You don't have to solve their wounds. All you have to do is drift. Drift like a forgotten letter between floorboards. Like perfume fading from a velvet ribbon. Like footsteps receding down an empty corridor. Let it all go. The palace doors are closed, the curtains drawn. Sleep now in the room that doesn't ask for anything from you. Not your body, not your name, not your loyalty. Just rest. You're safe now.